Good evening, everyone. Welcome tonight to Politics and Prose Bookstore. My name is Aisha. I'm a bookseller here at the Connecticut Avenue location, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here for our in-person event for the book Acrobat. Tonight, I will be passing over the reins to uh, our partnering group with the Atlantic Council, who will be introducing Nandana Dev Sen and Ambassador Rich Verma. Just some quick housekeeping notes, folks. Please, if you could, silence all cell phones. And for the course of tonight's event, we ask that all audience members remain masked. We will have our speakers up here, and we'll have to my left our microphone for questions and answers towards the end of the event. We'll also be having a signing line at the end of the event, and we ask that our guests please fold up your chairs and put them against the bookshelves to your right and left so that we can make some space for that queue. We will be joined to have our introductions from the President of the Atlantic Council, President and CEO Fred Kemp, who I'd like to welcome.
I can't tell you what a pleasure this is. I'm Fred Kemp. I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council and a massive fan of politics and prose. And my wife and I are neighbors. We don't live very far from here. And so on behalf of the Senior Director of the South Asia Center, Irfan Noureddin, and myself, on behalf of his staff, on behalf of Morgan, who's been leading on our side here, I just want to welcome you all here. I got to know politics and prose owners a long time ago, one of them at least, Brad Graham. I got to know Brad when he was covering Poland for the Washington Post, and I was covering Poland for the Wall Street Journal. And we all wonder what we're going to do beyond journalism. But I must say, Brad and Lissa Muscatine have created this amazing place that contributes to the neighborhood, to the city, and to the world. When the Atlantic Council and the Kemp family wants to buy books, we do it here. And we're glad you're doing that as well. So nothing could give me greater pleasure than briefly introducing this evening's program. An intimate conversation with my dear friend, Nandana Dev Sen, a uniquely talented actress, screenwriter, children's author, and child rights activist, and introducing her and congratulating her on the English publication of Acrobat, her late mother's remarkable book of Bengali poetry. An acclaimed Bengali poet, scholar, and writer, Nandana Dev Sen, Nandana's mother, who passed away in 2019, artfully reminds us of the invisible threads that bind us together in this powerful collection of books, of poems which transcend time and borders. Nandana herself is the author of 6 children's books, translated into more than 15 languages globally. She has starred in 20 feature films on 4 continents and in multiple languages, and I could say much more. She writes in the foreword to Acrobat, quote, "It has taken me a year to complete Acrobat, not that long considering that it represents an intricate body of work woven over 60 years, a year in which I have missed her at every word, with every line." And I'll leave it to Nandana to tell you the rest. She will be in conversation with Richard Verma, also a good friend of my wife Pam and myself, and he served as U.S. Ambassador to India for President Obama, playing a key role in the historic deepening and expansion of our ties with India. You still talk to people in India about Rich's time there and what he contributed to the country. But it's not just he contributed to the country helped create him. His parents were born in India and lived through the country's partition there, immigrating to the U.S. in the 1960s. And Rich, I think your father was an English professor, so some fitting connections there. I'm sure it will come out in the conversation. it would not be complete not to acknowledge also Nandana's husband and their child, who are both here. John Makinson is one of my longest standing friends on God's planet, dating back to our days competing against each other as child journalists in Germany. He was chairman of Penguin Random House, of London's National Theatre, and so much more. Megla is 7 years old. Her name means cloud. She's creative and so much fun, and she's a wonderful house guest. Thank you for visiting us in Washington, Megla, and for honoring your mother and your grandmother. And finally, I ask you to turn your eyes to the screen, and after that, Nandana and Rich will begin the program.
Hi, everyone. Fred, that was such a moving introduction to my mother's work, and I'm so grateful to you and to your amazing team at the Atlantic Council, at the South Asia Center, and to the stellar people at Politics and Prose for organizing this very special event despite the vagaries of a pandemic. All my thanks to Richard Verma for making the time to read this small book of poems with such love and sensitivity, and for keeping us on your calendar, even though we kept having to cancel this because of COVID month after month. I can't tell you how wonderful it is for me to be in this room with all of you in person, in one of the most inspiring bookstores in the world, one that I've admired for years, surrounded by the smell of books, which is perhaps my favorite smell in the whole world, and also surrounded by all of this warmth. I can see a lot of people here, a lot of you who knew my mother personally. I see many of you who know my mother through her work. And I can also see that many of you have come here because you want to learn more about my mother's work. So I thank you for the love that you've brought into this room. My mother and I signed this book 2 weeks before she died. We chose the title and the cover, which is a painting by Rabindranath Tagore, together. She was extremely excited about this book because although she had 100 books to her credit, this was the first time a book of hers was being published for an international audience. In fact, the last piece of writing that she did, which was her last column, was one that focused on this book. So she would have been thrilled to be here today. I have a special treat for all of you, which is a collection of poems that Richard has very beautifully curated for us this evening. I can't wait to read them to you. But I must say that what blew me away when I got the list from Rich is that he had chosen all the poems that my mother used to love reading in poetry meets, in lit fests, in Kobisham Milons, as we call them. So I grew up hearing these poems in Bangla, hearing her read them whenever she was asked to share her poetry. So thank you, Rich, for giving us this really beautiful selection of poems. I'm going to start with the title poem. মাদারি ভেবেছে সে বুঝি খুব সুন্দর মাদারি খেলা জানে দুহাতে সময়কে নিয়ে লোফালুফি এখন তখন দুটোই নাচাবে দুমুঠোতে হেঁটে যাবে দড়ির ওপরে ভেবেছে সে সব কিছু পারে জীবনে একবারই শুধু দড়ি কেঁপে ওঠে Acrobat. She thought she knew acrobatics rather well, that she could juggle time with both hands, play with the now right next to the then. She would make both dance, she thought, fist to fist, and she would glide so smooth along the tightrope. She thought she could do absolutely anything at all. Only once in your life will the rope shiver. The lamp. Memories on my mother's birthday. Go to sleep now, Ma. It's way past 11. 11? It's still early then, but you must go to bed. You're teaching tomorrow. Ma sits in her easy chair, thick glasses perched on her thin nose, pale fingers clutching her magnifying glass, the statesman spread out across her lap. Next to her, on the table, her flask of tea, her medicines, her fragrant betel leaf in its silver case, her brass spittoon, her cash box. Behind her, on the teapoy, an earthen vase filled with her favorite white tube roses, and a wicker table lamp, weaved in agartala. Before her, the alarm clock ticking away, her traveling timepiece. As Ma turns the pages of the newspaper, its noisy crackle splinters the quiet night. Closing my book, I come to her. As soon as I step inside, I drown in the deep perfume of those tube roses. The nurse is dozing in her chair. Ma, please go to sleep now. It's 1:30. 1:30? She scolds. And you're still awake? Don't you have college tomorrow? Swallowing the rebuke, I keep on wheedling. You'll get sick, Ma, if you stay up like this. You must take care of your body. My body? Ma breaks into laughter that sparkles, like jewelry shimmering from head to toe. How much more sick can it get? And what use is my body, anyway? I go to her one more time before I sleep. It's 2:30, Ma. Do call it a night. Come, let me take you to your bed. Yes, I'm coming, just coming. There's only this one tiny little bit left. Reading isn't so easy now, you see. It's the gift of these cataracts. With a slight smile, embarrassed, apologetic, she buries herself again in printed words. Under the glowing light of the table lamp, with her focus on the magnifying glass, the ticking of the alarm clock fades away. As I walk back to my room, I hear her speaking softly to the nurse. No, no, my dear. No, don't turn off the light. Keep that lamp switched on, please. I have just one more page left. Just one more page left. One more paragraph. One more sentence. Give me one more word, dear nurse. Just one more day. The Great Fair. You would take me to the Great Fair, you had promised. I'd buy a bamboo flute splashed with colors, a small chariot, 2 clay horses, little pots and pans, a mask, a golden-haired, glass-eyed doll. Making a list long enough to buy up the whole fair, filling my little cup with all the coins I'd saved. I waited for you on my steps. You were going to come back and take me with you to the great fair. As I waited on my steps, my limbs grew long, my list blew away in the wind. My cup of change became a trunk of gold. There is nothing left for me to buy from your great fair anymore. I'm going to get up from my steps now. This child. One day, this child too will die. This child, pure as milk, whom I've brought into this world with all my heart's desire and with fervent prayer, if she asks me now, on what promise have you thrust me into this strange and dazzling world? What grand celebration must I attend? I will be petrified. Choking with fear, with ignorance, I will run away to a dark cave, numb and empty. What answer will I give you? Poetry Witch. She came, yes, that demoness came back, cutting through all 3 ages. Taking a long, long sip from my bare vein, she said, "Here I am, right beside you. I'm here for you. I haven't abandoned you yet. Don't you see? The smell of blood draws me back, even today." Take back the night. Man. In the twilight, I could still hear the lark. Woman. The night was moonless, oppressively dark. Man. In the flowering woods, the night fairy walked. Woman. In the Sundarbans, the man-eater stalked. Man. In that fragrant springtime air. Woman. Blood-drenched remains lay there. Growing up lesson. Boy, are you scared of bloodshed? Are you terrified of plucking virginity? If the taste of blood goes to your head, do you fear that it will be a calamity? The truth is, whether wrong or right, your blood calls out to you each night. Listen, boy, it's time for you to grow. Words can be as fierce, don't you know? The treachery that lingers on tongue tips, beyond the world that all your dreams show. Know that blood can be easily shed by lips. Out of reach. I'll say this one to you in Bengali as well because there's a particular music to this poem. ভালোবাসা বারো তুমি চেয়েছিলে নিরুপাধি প্রেম অনধিগম্য আমি গেথে আনি লবঙ্গলতা তোমারই জন্য তুমি বুঝি চাও প্রেমের বাতাস নাতিশীতোষ্ণ আমি বইয়ে দি কাল বৈশাখী ভয়াল কৃষ্ণ তোমার প্রণয় প্রযুক্ত নয় দূর বিশুদ্ধ আমার প্রণয় কিছুটা যুদ্ধ You asked for a nameless love out of reach. I weaved you a wreath of blooms, each to each. You want love's temperate breeze, softly sighing. I blow you a thunderstorm, terrifying. Your love is detached, afar, chaste to its core. My love is in part love, and in part war. These beloved faces. I can no longer bear to watch my loved ones wilt with age. With my eyes wide open, I can't bear to see these beloved faces melt like clouds, As pond scum thickens around the pools of their eyes, the brows collapse like a dead bird's wings. The lips dry up in the dust like unripe fruit plucked by storms. How everything dries, how everything flies away in the wind like scraps of paper, how everything disappears. How the heart folds up its tent and steps into the road, readying itself to raise a hand and hail a car for hire. To raise that hand to say goodbye and go. The heart retreats and folds, as I now see. It takes all shining pots and pans from the rack and shatters them on cold stone with a deafening crash. How, in the heat of the sun, all sounds fade away. All traces vanish. Those beloved faces, like clouds, change their form and float away. With my eyes wide open, I can't bear to see the burnt grass in the yard, so close to me. Make up your mind. Make up your mind. Who do you want? That woman or me? Within me breathe two people. Make up your mind. Who do you want? That woman or me? Last two. Right now, forever. Time has not the power to extinguish me. Don't think for a moment that I wait upon time. Let time keep on playing his absurd battle game. Every time he strips me, I rise clothed without shame. With the force of prayer, of spells magic and divine, all that was untimely will turn auspicious, sublime. In a just war, the rebel stands forever unafraid, for her ally is eternity, who, divinely arrayed, guides her chariot, destroying the enemy line. Thus, a divisive age will be defeated and spurned. Though it brings on great wars, it will lose every time. From all our scriptures, this is the truth I have learned. Please know that I am cherished by an undivided, infinite age. Time will never have the power to scorch me with its rage. And the final one, Return of the Dead. Receive me then, Kolkata. I am your true love, your whole world. I'm back from the war, an aborted mother. I have brought the ocean with me instead. My lap is empty, yes, but my breasts are heavy, overflowing with wasted milk. Look at the fathomless salt water in my eyes. Come then, look at me. See how virginity burns on my brow again, fiery as the setting sun. Touch me, for my newborn flesh belongs to you now. Receive me then, Kolkata, in your waiting arms. Your loneliness is over at last. I have returned just as you had wanted me to. Why this stunned silence then? This anxious glance? This daze? Lift your face. Don't shift your eyes. Speak to me. Your prayers were heard. Here I am, returned from the dead. Yes, it's me. Your childhood sweetheart. Your world of passion. Your old flame. Your very own Nobonita. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. That was spectacular, really.
Thank you for choosing
You wanna
those
use
poems.
this?
They were, it was brilliant curation.
There's a big risk when you ask a lawyer to curate poems. Let me tell you. I was also quite worried when you started in Bengali. I was a little worried that I was going to have to tell you that my knowledge of Bengali language was not so good. But that was a great way to start. I really feel like we know your mother. We know her just hearing you read these few poems that you did. And I want to know a lot more about her, but I also just want to understand her process. Tell us about how she did this and why she was so committed to Bengali language, because these poems were not in English, the vast majority of them.
No, none of them
Yeah.
were.
And if you speak into this microphone, they'll hear you live stream.
Thank you. I always am terrible with mics. So my mother decided she was absolutely bilingual. She had a very busy career as an international scholar of comparative literature, and so all her academic work, her feminist work that was scholarly, she did in English. She went back to India, and that's that last poem that you had asked me to read, Return of the Dead, is about that time when she returns. Before that, when she was living in England, she actually wrote a lot of wonderful poetry in English as well. But when she flew back to India with us, to very, difficult to manage little girls, she decided that she would write all of her creative work in Bengali. And it was a political choice, she said very clearly, because she felt quite strongly that regional literatures and languages in India were really at risk of becoming obsolete. And she felt that writers who were writing in the mother tongues had a responsibility to keep writing and supporting the literatures in their native languages. I mean, it's of course a wonderful day today because the Booker Prize, as we know, went to a wonderful Indian writer in translation whose book Tomb of Sand is a translation from Hindi. Gitanjali Shri. So it's a day to celebrate, and I was thinking that my mother would have been so happy that this had finally happened. But she was very worried, and actually what she had predicted in the 70s turned out to be true. She was concerned that in the future, Indian writing would be identified as Indian writing in English only. So all of Indian writing would be represented through Indian writing in English, which she loved, right? But that is actually the truth, isn't it? So when I think, if we ask any of you who your favorite Indian writers are, you are going to say, whether it's Amitav Ghosh or Arundhati Roy. I mean, they are writers who, thank you. They are writers who write in English. And so she wanted to write in Bengali to make sure that the rich cultural heritage that we have in India, which is a multilingual, multiliterary culture, could be preserved. She was also a language activist in the sense that she believed very strongly in the importance of translation and recognizing translation as a literary form, not as a technical job. So she worked very hard to kind of draw attention to the fact that the quality of translations and the status of translations had to grow in India.
But then this presents a significant challenge, I guess, opportunity for you. You're presented with all of these wonderful poems in Bengali, and you've got to figure out a way, how do I be true to what she wrote and convert these into English poems for wider audiences without losing her meaning, these are not, you're not translating a novel. You're translating poems where you have to be exact. You're almost rewriting the poems. Tell us, how do you do that?
That's a really interesting question. And there's so many challenges there are many challenges to translating anyway. But in this case, there were, as you said rightly, there were challenges of different kinds. I have to say that a large part of the challenge was emotional because this was a project that I was planning to do and hoping to do with my mother. And, she passed away just after we signed it, and then the pandemic hit the world. So it was this very strange time in all of the world. And this is the only project that I could work on. But what happened was, because I was so close to my mother and I knew these poems intimately, as I was translating them, I kept hearing my mother's voice, not as a, I don't mean in my imagination. It literally felt like she was in the room speaking to me. And yet I was so intensely aware of the fact that I had lost her. So that was, it was difficult to, and then at the same time I was also recognizing, my mother's poetry was very different from her prose, which if there's time we can talk about later, but her poetry was always very heart-wrenching, her prose was always very uplifting. And there's a lot of pain in her poetry, and I think as a translator, as you said, you kind of rewrite it. I mean, to find the language to express her pain at a time when I was lost in my own grief. I don't know if I'm able to explain it very articulately, but that was very hard because there were many layers of grieving that was happening in the process of this book coming together. I mean, grieving in a positive sense too, in terms of coping, in terms of processing. But so the emotional challenge of it was the hardest. But then technically, my mother, poetry is always hard to translate, as you said. My mother was particularly brilliant with rhymes, and she loved them. And not all of her poetry, as you could hear, some of them, half of them are in rhyme, half of them are not in rhyme. But she used rhymes very consciously and economically, but brilliantly, to emphasize emotions, to spring surprises, to register her dissent, very, very cleverly. So I felt that I owed it to her poetry to translate into rhyme any poem that she had written in rhyme. So every rendition of mine of a poem that had been written in rhyme, I felt had to be translated into rhyme, which took a lot of time. There was also the way poem scans, the metrical sort of the rhythm of the poem, right, apart from the rhyming. She also did these amazing things, like she would make up words. She was fantastic at neologisms. She loved using words that would have multiple meanings. So as a translator, you either have to make a decision about which way you're going to go, or find or create similarly ambiguous language to kind of be able to be true to that, to the layers that she intentionally put in. The other thing that made it hard was that I don't like footnotes in poetry. I actually don't like footnotes in fiction either, but especially not in poetry. So I decided that I would not have any footnotes, which meant, because my mother also very lovingly had many loving references to our classical literatures, to our archetypal heroines, as in Right Now Forever, that poem that I read almost at the end, which invokes Draupadi's Vastraharan and Kurukshetra. Anyone, we would know about that, but I wanted to translate it to an audience that may not know about Kurukshetra or the Mahabharata, but to whom the epic proportions of what we were discussing and the universality of it, of every woman's fear, every woman's vulnerability, of the way women become casualties of war every time, and the violence that is inevitable. So how do you find ways of conveying all of that without actually pointing to footnotes was another challenge. So
What's interesting is that you said her poetry was more about her grief and her anguish, and her prose was more positive. You pick that up in the book. There's incredible themes about nature, about strength, about perseverance, but there are also themes of loneliness and sorrow, and I just wonder if you could say a little bit about that. What was it? Here's a woman that was amazingly successful, beloved in the country, in the community, this incredible family, but she was expressing either fears or concerns. What was going on?
You know, it was the mic police, mostly my 7-year-old daughter, whose laughter, cackle you can hear, even without a mic. Um, so it's so my mother was in life a very optimistic, rambunctious personality. I'm sure you would all agree, everybody who knew her. She was larger than life. She was always laughing. She made everyone laugh. She was really kind of full of sunshine. And it was true. It was not an air that she put on. That was as much part of who she was as was the part that really delved deep into her soul and allowed herself to be emotionally naked in a way that was actually breathtaking. The kind of the way in which she made herself vulnerable through her poetry was stunning. I haven't actually seen that kind of nakedness, emotional nakedness in a lot of writing. But I think, you know, what's interesting about this is just, I have to say that even though I knew all of these poems, and I had known them all my life, what happened is that I took them I knew them by heart. I had heard her read them, you know, years and years and years. I assumed that I understood everything about them. I took my intimacy with the poetry for granted in the same way that I took my intimacy with my mother for granted. And when I was translating it, only because I was then, you know, reading it all together and kind of trying to read it chronologically, as I was trying to figure out how to organize this book. And it really felt like I was reading this unedited journal. And there were so many layers of her emotional history that I had just not understood when she was alive. And part of it was this, how intensely lonely she was, as you said. I hadn't quite understood why it had never worked between my parents. I mean, they were both wonderful people. They really loved each other till the end. They stayed great friends. They believed in the same things. You know, they had the same politics, all of those things. But it was actually translating her poetry, because when you translate, as you said earlier, it's not the way you're not interacting with the poem as a reader, or even as a daughter for that matter. You are entering the poem, and you are claiming those emotions to be yours, right? You have to make them your own, and it was in doing so that I understood, actually much better than I had ever done before, why it didn't work between my parents. I understood that estrangement, that disintegration much better. I understood how much my mother relied on poetry as a coping mechanism. I understood what a complicated relationship she had with my grandmother, with whom she was, on the one hand, very close, but on the other, there was also quite a bit of tension between them. So there were all of these things.
So the poems really helped you rediscover her in many ways.
In ways that I had not
it's
known
interesting.
her before.
We do want to take your questions from the audience. There is a microphone up here, so please do. If you have questions, yes, there's and because I have about 12 more questions, then we'll never get to your question. So if you have a question, do you want them to come up to the microphone? Yes, if you could come up to the microphone. You have.
Hi.
Sorry, I didn't realize I had to come all the way here.
It's okay.
So my name is Debolina, and it's so nice to finally meet you in person.
Hi,
Nandana.
Debolina.
Can you come closer to the microphone?
I think I'm a little
There you
short.
go. Okay.
Yeah,
There
I
you
think
go.
this is much better. In your book, you talk about how you and your mom prepared a modest list of poems that you wanted to translate in the
Right.
beginning. And of course, you went on to do all of those translations, and then you added a few more to that list. Sorry. So just wanted to know what made you choose certain poems over others, and was there a process? Was there an intention? And are you planning to come out with the translations for the remaining of the poems, which maybe didn't find a place in this book?
Well, that's a great question. You know, my mother and I started this list, so everything on that list was translated, as you said. And then what I really wanted this book to represent her 60 years of poetry, which meant I chose poems that she wrote over different times of her life. And you can see that the way she wrote actually changed over time. Her earlier poems were longer and much more intricate in some ways, and much more self-consciously formal, whereas her later poetry was quite influenced by forms like the haiku. So they were short, they were poems where the heart of the poem would be hidden in one word in the last line. So it was a very different way. So I wanted to find the right balance between older and newer poems, between shorter and longer poems, between poems in rhyme, poems not in rhyme, between happy poems and sad poems, political poems, personal poems. So there were all of these. I kind of had a list like this, and believe it or not, I sort of listed how many poems I had in each kind to make sure that it was.
You know, what's interesting is there's a lot of poems about poems.
Yes.
And the process of writing, one of the ones you read for us at the beginning, The Lamp, has, the reason I picked that out, this incredible vivid descriptions that you have of your mother, from, you know, everything around her on her nightstand to her perfume, but also just, she would not go to bed until that last page, that last paragraph, that last word, and it was like this fuel that just sustained her. Is that what you wanted to convey, and what she wanted to convey?
It's a very beautiful way of saying that. You know, yes, absolutely. So my mother, so that's a poem that my mother wrote about my grandmother, after my grandmother had died, on my grandmother's birthday, the year after she died, in fact. But when I was translating it, it really became a poem about my mother and me, you know, which goes to say that we all eventually become our mothers. I definitely feel that I am, and I should be so lucky, of course. But so my mother did refuse to let go of paper and pen until the last minute. She started writing poems when she was a child. She published her first book of poetry when she was 21, and she kept scribbling poems until the last days of her life. She had a kobitar khata she left under her pillow, and the need that she had to be connected to the world of words was compulsive. And it's something that I think it's interesting that you should choose that poem, because it's kind of about 3 generations in a way. It's about my mother and my grandmother, but by translating it, it sort of also has become about my mother and me. And I think we've really benefited, we've really inherited this legacy in our family, which is a matrilineal legacy, I should say, of poetry and of learning to cope through poetry. I was talking earlier about how difficult it was to do this book so soon after my mother died. But looking back, now that it was a couple of years ago, I can see that just like my mother, she had said a number of times that if she hadn't had poetry in her life, then she would have disintegrated, and poetry was such a survival tool for her. And you know, in doing this, I realized that it had become a survival tool for me too, just in the way it had been for her, the translation and the kind of continuation of the conversation that I could have with her because of the translation. And it's something that I think I inherited from my grandmother as well as my mother.
Other questions from the audience? Don't be shy. Here, please. Yeah, if you could go.
Thank you. Hi, Nandana. It's so good to meet you. I'm Gayatri Patel with the Women's Refugee Commission. Good to meet you. He's feeling okay. I wanted to ask, I mean, you mentioned in the introduction of the book that your mother really felt that poetry was so critical to the voice of women. And she certainly wrote her poetry being of the generation that she was, and you were translating it from the generation that you were. How did that interact with your translation. The fact that you were a woman in a different time than when she actually wrote her poetry.
That is another excellent question. I'll give you an example, perhaps, which will show it. An example shall be given, and all will be clear. So, the poem that he had chosen called Right Now Forever. I mentioned earlier that my mother had really loved messing us up by creating new words and using words that could mean a number of things. So she uses a word there called khondokal. Now, khondokal doesn't, there are lots of Bengalis here. How many Bengalis left? A lot, yes. So we know that khondokal actually doesn't exist as a word. If we open the Cholontika, we wouldn't find it. But it's clear what it means, except that it can mean a number of things. It can mean a part of time. It can mean a part of the time. It can mean divided time. It can mean divisive time. And they all mean very different things. Now, in answer to your question, because I was translating it in the context that I live in, to me, the right choice was divisive, because I was translating this poem into a time that across the world had become a divisive time. And that therein lay the universality of what she was saying about what a woman has to endure and how a woman survives no matter what. And that, to me, was connected to the divisiveness of the time. So that's how. So in other words, I think I changed, I took some liberties about, I think the context into which you translate a piece of work is as relevant as the context in which it was written, because it will be consumed and shared and understood and loved in the context in which it is written, it's translated, right? But thank you, that's a very nuanced question.
Well, that poem in particular, there's a great quote, "Time will never have the power to scorch me with its rage."
Yes.
It really demonstrated, I read that and I thought, she's saying, bring it on.
Yes, absolutely.
I can handle this.
Yes.
She was tough.
She was so tough. She was tough, but she was also very tender. She was, she had an incredible capacity to love, which her friends here would attest to. Whether it was her students, obviously her family she loved, but her students, her fans, she would spend hours answering fan mail, not because she was in any way narcissistic, but because she felt accountable to her readers. She really saw that as a one-on-one relationship. So she was this amazing combination of being fierce, but also being very, very loving and tender.
Yeah, very strong. Other questions from the audience? Let me ask you, the last poem that you read, Return of the Dead.
Yeah.
It starts with the line, "Receive me then, Calcutta." Receive me. I'm ready to come home. And again, like the other poems in the book, it's both inspiring and sad.
Yes.
At the same time. She's coming back to the place she loves, where she is beloved. But is she coming back because she knows she's getting to that point? That's how I don't know, I came away with more of a sadness of that poem, but she knew that was where she wanted to be.
There are things, as you mentioned earlier, that there's this sense of a promise not being kept that is there in the other poem you had selected. In the other poem you had selected called The Great Fair. Right. And I think what happened with this poem is, when my mother left Calcutta, she left as this kind of impossibly glamorous person. She was a brilliant student. She had topped her, university in Calcutta. She was going off to study at Harvard. She had a book published. She was also an artist, a very talented artist. She had exhibitions of her artwork. She was engaged to someone who seemed pretty destined to become a superstar as well. And she had lots and lots of admirers. Everybody was in love with my mother. So when she left, and she was sort of kind of connected to the heartbeat of the literary, cultural circle in Calcutta. And there was great kind of hahutash, jeta amra boli, a lot of sadness when she decided that she would leave. And 10, 12 years later, when the marriage was not working, and she had us, she decided to come back. But at that time, even though she belonged to quite a socially progressive circle, and this was of course under communist rule in Kolkata, nobody actually knew anyone who had been divorced. So even in her circle, which was arguably the most progressive, one of the most radical ones, people didn't actually know how to respond to a divorcee. I mean, people would get separated and live in different places, but wouldn't get divorced, wouldn't get remarried. My father got remarried shortly after that. So there was a lot of awkwardness. And I think that's a very, I don't think there is any, there's a lot of, it's typical of a lot of her poetry where there's no artifice in it. There's a lot of artistry in that poem, but there is no, what she says is exactly what she means. She did expect there to be a very warm welcome, but the city, it took a while for the city to figure out how to fit her into it again and where she would actually belong. I mean, it didn't take her, she wrote another book, which became, she found her place fairly quickly because of who she was. But I think she was disappointed in the fact that this place, which she saw as a place of unconditional love, didn't quite know how to respond to this person who had come back with what seemed like a failed life so far.
One more question. I think we have time for one more from the good friend and former Assistant Secretary of State, Nisha Biswal.
Thanks, Rich. Thank you for this beautiful evening.
I'm so glad you could come. How are you feeling?
I feel great, thanks.
Great.
So, your translation, your interpretation of your mother's poetry is so beautiful. And you talk about how your mom saw herself always as a poet because that was the mirror in which she first saw her face.
Yes.
How do you see yourself?
Wow. That is, I have never thought of that. As in, I would say I see myself as a daughter, but that's not what you're asking.
Well, you had to inhabit the poem to be able to translate it. And the language is a very poetic language. So I was just curious, do you see yourself as a poet?
In the context of the book, how I definitely saw myself as, I had to see myself as a poet and I had to take liberties that a poet would take. Without that, I don't think I could have done it. So I saw, I had to kind of inhabit the role of a poet in terms of being able to do the work that I needed to do, because there was also so much, it was a constant struggle between form and content because her form was so particular and she was a perfectionist. So I had to kind of do right by her. And then she was also she had a very strong sense of social justice, and that came into her work as well. So I had to do right by her at a number of different levels, and I felt that, so I was definitely more of a poet than a daughter or a critic at that time. I don't think I could have afforded to have the distancing that I would have had if I was looking at it as a critic. So I had to kind of embrace the identity of a poet and hope that she was sending me kind of divine vibes.
Well, Nandana, you're going to close us out with a reading that is actually your words from the end of the book, and it's pretty incredible. I just want to thank you for being here, for spending this time with us. Thank the Atlantic Council Politics and Prose, all of you, if you haven't gotten the book, you should get the book. It's pretty incredible. But I'm going to turn it back over to you and let you read the last kind of message to all of us and to your mother.
Thank you so much, Rich. Thank you. This is a poem I started writing to my mother on her 75th birthday. So what's lovely about it is that she actually read most of it. I would keep adding to it over the years on every birthday, but I only managed to finish it after she died. So I'll read a little excerpt of that to you. Letter to Ma. It is true I was created in you. It is also true that you were created for me. Maya Angelou. My first semester in college. You arrived in between your conferences, suitcases and admirers in tow, refusing abundant offers of hospitality in Cambridge. You shared and immediately redecorated the 1.5 rooms assigned to my 2 roommates and me. Every morning, you stood in line in our noisy dormitory to claim your 3 minutes in the shower. You left after a week, just as I was getting used to finding your hip-length hair in my comb and turning every head in the 1,000-strong Harvard Union when you swept into dinner with me, gliding in like a queen, like you always did. A few weeks later, we hit midterm exams. I overslept the first day, found the showers occupied, and sprinted down the hall to the other bathroom in total panic. As I stumbled onto freezing tiles and fiddled with the cranky knob that spurted cold water for red and boiling for blue, something miraculously familiar caught my eye. A crimson dot of velvet on the narrow gray wall. Your well-traveled bindi, carefully transported from your forehead and placed beyond reach of the spray. In a flash, I could hear your laugh and smell your scent. I could feel the tension in my neck melt into the mist surrounding me. That perfect circle of red gave evidence on that mildewed wall that you would always be there, far away, so close. Although there were unending demands on your time, a few years ago you had somehow managed to find several days for us to translate together my bedtime book for children, Not Yet. The book is a playful dialogue in rhyme between a mother and a child. A naughty little girl finds countless excuses not to go to bed. The literal Bengali translation of Not Yet is Akhonina. But you had laughed your own little girl laugh and declared, no, the girl must be much more emphatic. She will say, Ekkunina, Ekkunina. Well, this obstinate daughter of yours kept saying to her mother in the last few days, Ekkunina, Ekkunina. Could you hear me, Ma? Not too long ago, I pulled a big blue book from our Kolkata shelf, 365 bedtime stories. When I opened it, out fell a red gold rush of leaves, oaks, maples, and ferns collected in London when I was a toddler. One night, as you were reading to me about Tinker Bell, I had interrupted you with a technical question. What are fairy wings made of? Butterfly wings? Bird feathers? Or huge petals? There are all kinds of fairies, you see, you replied, just as there are all kinds of people. Well, do all fairies look like you? I persisted. I don't think so, you smiled. Fairies are very beautiful. But Ma, I protested, you're the most beautiful person in the world. You laughed, much more raucously than Tinker Bell would. Every little girl believes that about their mother, Tumpush. Well, Ma, I've grown up a bit. My world has grown up a lot. I left home as a child and made beautiful friends who became my family. In my work, I've met many beautiful faces, walked with beautiful figures. I've fallen in love with beautiful minds. You grew up too. More books published, many awards won. A few more clashes with your stubbornly loving daughters around your eyes. A few more lines celebrating years of full-throated life. More world tours, many with me, when you swept me away with your infectious appetite for discovery. Remember that list we made of unvisited countries you absolutely had to explore? Wheelchair in tow, we made it to most entries on that list. China, Egypt, South Africa, but not Burma. Each time we traveled, you transformed our adventures into provocative essays or best-selling books. And on every trip, we shared even more pleasures together than our plentiful arguments. Yes, we did have fights. I cried when you didn't understand. I begged you not to nag. I yelled at you when I was upset with someone else. I watched in panic as tears welled up in your ever-adolescent eyes. But I am as sure today as I was that night in London that even if you had not been my mother, even if that most precious accident of birth had by rights been the beginning of someone else's story, even if I'd met you in any of your other roles as a poet, professor, painter, friend, or a stranger on a plane, you would still be the most beautiful person I could ever have met. At the end of Not Yet, the daughter asks, Ma, did you turn out the light? And the mother replies, yes, my dear. Now, good night. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Navanita. We will be having a signing right up here. The line will start right where I'm standing. The books are available back at the registers. And please remember to fold up your chairs and lean them against something solid. Thank you very much.